let's talk about St. Catherine of Genoa. Her name is Catherine Fieschi, as you can see in the name of the father. She was born in Genoa in 1447, and she died in Genoa on 15 September 1510, and her feast day is September 15th within the church. The life of St. Catherine is described more appropriately as a state, not necessarily a life. And that will be made clear, I think, as we go along. Because in the ordinary sense of life, we kind of roll through our lives trying to make sense of what's going on and what God wants in our lives for us. Whereas St. Catherine, at the age of 25, had an experience of God's intense love, and for the remainder of her life, lived in the unitive state. She lived in perfect communication and unity with God for the rest of her life, some 25 or 26 years, where everything she did was at the behest and in the guidance of God. Not really a life as you and I might experience it, but a state of life, a state of being, a precursor to heaven. And so in that state, she was able to experience some amazing and wonderful revelations. The modern biographies of Catherine speak about those experiences. They're primarily found in two books. One is The Fire of Love, a modern translation. It's The Understanding of Purgatory. And the other is The Dialogues of the Soul and Body. And again, in that era, many of the writings were in the form of the body speaking to the soul, speaking to self-love, speaking to the spirit. And so there's an interesting dialogue that goes on in this body of works where she battles the drives and the yearnings and the ideas that the human spirit puts forth. So, how about a little bit now about Catherine of Genoa, not Alphonsus de Liguori, about Catherine. Her parents were Jacopo Fieschi, of illustrious Italian birth. He ultimately became the Viceroy of Naples, but he did die when Catherine was very young. I couldn't find any reference as to what age, but they speak about her being very young. And her mom, Francesca di Negro, was also of illustrious birth. And so it means that they had some influence and some pretty powerful positions in their culture and in their environment. Yet, when Dad died, they ran onto some bad times. And it led to some decisions later on in Catherine's life. Of note in Catherine's life, she comes from a family that had two popes in her lineage. Pope Innocent IV, who reigned from June of 1243 to December 1254, and he was born Sinibaldo di Fieschi. And Pope Adrian V, who reigned from July 12th, 1276 to August 18th, 1276, a very short reign, and he was born Ottobueno Fieschi. Okay, there we go. Catherine was described in her biographies as an extraordinarily holy child. She was very gifted in the way of prayer. She had a wonderful love for Christ's passion, and she lived a life of penitential practice. She was quiet and very obedient. Around the age of 13, she had a deep hunger and a yearning to enter the convent. But the nuns at the convent where her confessor petitioned for her to enter refused, as she was too young. She needed to be at least 16. As a young adult, around the age of 16, again, because of family finances, her brother and her mother decided that she needed to marry, and she was married to a young Genoese nobleman named Giuliano Adorno. And the marriage turned out to be a disaster. He was a spendthrift. He was faithless. He was violent-tempered. He was just a mean SOB. And he treated her very badly. And so her life was really a misery. The details are scanty, but the literature that you can find on her life indicates that those first 5 years were horrible. She lived in a melancholic silence, it says, and she submitted herself to her husband. For the next 5 years, Catherine turned to the world for her consolation. And when we talk about turning to the world, we talk about doing things like shopping a little bit with her contemporaries. We talk about attending the operas like her contemporaries. We talk about participating in parties and that sort of things. Pretty low-key earthly adventures, but nonetheless, because of her early bent, because of that yearning that she had for a great relationship with God, she felt herself being drawn away from God. And that becomes evident in the dialogues of how she speaks to the soul at some point, or she speaks to the body and said, "You misled me. You tried to draw me away, but no longer. I am going to control you. You no longer will run me. I will run you. For I am the spirit, I am the soul, I am the one with the power in our relationship, and I will guide you." And so that whole sense of lukewarmness and that internal battle led to a period of depression towards that latter part of that last 10 years. And she was in a place of depression. Now, one of the things that I didn't mention early on is that her eldest sister had become a nun. And she was in frequent contact with that sister. And one day, she had been speaking with her sister, and her sister invited her to attend the sacrament of confession at the convent. And so Catherine did, in fact, respond to her sister's call. It's called that great intervention in Catherine's life, where she went to confession to this priest, and just as she entered the confessional, it's described as a ray of God's light pierced her heart. Pierced her heart such that she wasn't even able to remain alert. Interestingly enough, the story goes that her confessor had to leave the confessional while she's in the confessional in a state of ecstasy. And this ecstatic experience was one in which a very, very powerful experience happened. On the one hand, she saw the horror, the ugliness, and the blackness of her soul. Now here's a young lady who was regularly confessed, attended liturgy regularly, received the sacraments, and she experienced the black horror that her soul has been, while simultaneously experiencing God's love and mercy for each and every one of those sins. And so she saw the personal sin, God's mercy, personal sin, God's mercy, as God iterated through her heart and through her soul, exposing the powerfulness of God's love and the ugly horror that our apparent misbehaviors and small sins really are, and how God sees them. And from that moment in time, the next 25 years, she had a vision of herself and God. And what she essentially experienced is what has become clear as to what purgatory is. That experience of the soul immersed in the mercy of God, being purified of the horrors of disobedience of God, of shunning God, of living a life that is mediocre and lukewarm and partial in its submission to God's will. She lived a life of penance. And again, that book that she wrote, The Spiritual Dialogue Between the Soul, the Body, self-love and the Spirit, she speaks about that interrelationship between, and I'd like to read a paragraph from there, and it speaks about what Catherine lived and what, frankly, I suspect you and I have gone through ourselves. And this is a quote. "My brothers, I have come to know that God is about to do a work of love on my behalf, and therefore I shall take no more heed of you, your needs, your words, for I surely know that if I heed you, I shall perish, although I would never have believed it if I had not experienced it. Under the appearance of good and necessity, you have well nigh led me to the death of sin, and have done all you could to bring me to perdition. Now, I intend to do to you what you have wished to do to me, and I shall hold you in no more respect than if you were my deadly enemies. Never expect to be on good terms with me again. Give up all hopes of it, as if you were among the lost. I shall strive to return to that path which I first entered, and from which you caused me to swerve by your deceits. I hope, however, through the divine light, that you will deceive me no more. And in the meanwhile, I shall do all things in such manner that the necessities of each will be satisfied. If you have led me to do what I ought not, in order to satisfy your appetites, I would lead you to do what you do not desire, in order to satisfy the Spirit. I shall not spare you, even if you are worn out, even as you spared me not when I was so enslaved by you that you did with me according to your pleasure. I hope to bring you into such subjection to myself as to change your natures." Catherine's experience of God's love was such that, by the power of her will in her spirit, she was able to subdue the sinful nature of her body and those sinful desires which can overcome her, try to overcome her, and frankly, by extension, which overcome us, and reined them in such that she lived as if she were in heaven on earth. Now, it's a wonderful image to have, but without that power of God's love to the degree that she had it, I'm not espousing that we could achieve that. However, it's certainly a consideration for us to have, that perhaps we need to look more deeply at our own behaviors and the force of strength that we allow the body to have on our eternal soul. So then, for about 25 years, Catherine lived on earth those experiences of the souls in purgatory. And that's how she could write this treatise on purgatory, wherein the church's teaching comes to clarity as to how wonderful, frankly, a place purgatory really is. Towards the end of her life, she was actually able, finally, the last few years, to find someone who could be her spiritual guide. Who, can you imagine, could possibly understand the extent, intention, and intensity of God's love that was pouring into her heart to help guide her? Who could help her sort that out? So she lived a life of utter isolation, her and God alone on the earth. Yet, during her life, she became a nurse in the hospital at Genoa. She prayed fervently and maintained a relationship with her husband, celibate though it was, and actually affected by her prayers his final conversion, and served the hospital, becoming not only the nurse, but the caretaker and accountant, and maintained the books for the big hospital in Genoa. So not only did she live a life of unitive experience with God, her work in the world did not end. But rather, she interacted with people only in so much as she had to, and encountered life in a temporal sense in the power of God's presence. Again, Father Catenio Marabotti was appointed her spiritual guide near the end of her life, and he was the one who penned her memoirs. He did so by the personal knowledge he had by way of being her confessor. And it turns out that she maintained her leadership role in the hospital at Genoa for some 13 years after her husband died. He died in 1497, and she died in 1510. The biographies speak about the fact that she died out physically worn out. Body, soul, the fires of divine love consumed all of the darkness and sins within her. And so her body was literally consumed. She was beatified in 1675 by Clement X. She was canonized in 1737 by Clement XII. And during the interim of her death and her canonization, obviously in the process, her writings were examined by the Holy See and pronounced valid and good for us to study. They're rich and powerful in the explanation of that relationship between the body and self-love and the spirit and humanity. And when you engage in those readings, you will begin to understand, I think, to a greater degree, the turmoil that I suspect that you experience in your own life as you examine your own behaviors, as you examine your anger responses, as you examine your selfish responses when you're called to love. I know I was. Reading Catherine's books, particularly her memoirs, and the document that I have that I listed, it's a 144-page document. It's surprisingly easy reading. Some of it is actually the quotation that I read was taken from that document. It's from the spiritual dialogue, and you will find great insight, I think, as you examine Catherine's readings. One of the things I wanted to do was, let's take away some lessons from Catherine's life. Sin. Catherine clearly, as she experienced that ray of divine light, saw sin for what it was, a horrible black ugliness that separates the human spirit from God. And she writes about the fact that sin is really a denial of the human spirit. It's a breaking of who we are and what we're intended to be. And we break that spirit in its union with the Spirit of God. And so as we live our lives, even with venial sins, we're allowing ourselves to be separated from that which we were created for. And these sins are indeed great offenses. We call them venial and mortal sins, we do, but they're still great offense to the masterful, merciful love of God. And they bear infinite consequences. When you read about the suffering, the intense, enormous, painful suffering that goes on even in purgatory that Catherine records, the consequences are huge. So do you want to suffer consequences, Catherine says, here on earth, where the effect of our suffering is greater than the application of God's justice for the purification that is required to be in the presence of God as totally holy? She brings to light that, make no mistake about it, the sufferings and the consequences are great. We really need to come to an understanding of how great an offense sin is. And frankly, they're far more prevalent than we choose to believe. They're in our thinking, they're in our attitudes, they're in our perception of others, they're in our behavior. Make no mistake about it. All those things that you might think are small offenses against God are going to have great consequences. And Catherine points that out incredibly clearly. I can't more strongly recommend reading this book, The Fire of Love, Understanding Purgatory, and get an understanding of the type of suffering that you and I will go through should we not purify ourselves here by engaging in the necessary purification that we need to be perfect as God is perfect. We heard that this Sunday in the gospel. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. The second thing I wanted to touch base on is on purgatory. It's the place of the final purification of the soul. Number one, it's real. It is a doctrine of the church, but it's real. It's a place of intense suffering. But it's a place that the soul desires to go out of great love for God. Because in purgatory, that which will separate us perfectly from God is removed. It's burned away. It's cleansed. And we're set free from all of those burdens that sit and roll around in our minds as we look at our own behavior and we truly reflect and contemplate as to who we are. Those have to be burned away. But it's a place where God's mercy is absolutely present. And the incredible thing to understand about purgatory, although it is a place of intense suffering, like Christ on the cross, who suffered immensely, it is a place of great joy. For it is a place wherein we enter into the heart and will of God. And so it is a place where Catherine saw that, and she experienced herself that when you enter into the suffering that is necessary to purify the attitudes and ways of thinking that we bring into our own existence, it is a place of great joy where we encounter God in a richer way. She speaks about hell. Again, it's real. Again, it's a place of intense suffering. Again, it's a place chosen by the soul by virtue of the life it has led on this earth. It is a place also where God's mercy is present. Interestingly enough, she speaks about the fact that in hell, the full intensity and infinite power of God's wrath is not imposed upon the soul. If the soul had to experience the infinite wrath of God, it might not survive. But in hell, the soul which chose to be there lives in its own isolation and horror. But the difference, the enormous difference, is hell is a place of great horror. We need to recognize the potential. Should we choose to live our lives inappropriately, hell is an option. It's a possibility. And it has been seen not only by Catherine, but by any number of saints. Consider Bernadette Soubirous and the visionaries at Fatima. They too saw hell. Make no mistake about it. We need to get that message out. Finally, she speaks about holiness, about having a spirit of purity. We must be perfect to enter the presence of God. And the message that I took away could be summed up perhaps in pay me now or pay me later. Where do you want to encounter God? How soon do you want to encounter God? Work at purity of life here or spend time in purgatory. The beauty of purgatory, we're in heaven. After a while, it's a guarantee. That's what the church will tell us. However, where do you want to be purified? Remember that achieving purity of spirit, impossible for the human being. Chris says it so well. He quotes Francis de Sales. Our effort is necessary but insufficient. We must make the effort, but we must cry out to God. We can only become pure if we submit ourselves to the will of God, and means living out our lives as our vocation calls us to. And frankly, it requires much suffering, for sin is a horrible veil which impedes our ability to encounter God and live with him in the richest possible way. And we have to peel that veil away, sin by sin, perverted thought by perverted thought. We have no choice but to call upon the grace of God.
So behold the Lamb who was slain, who was